In a packed courtroom, Judge Terenga slammed his gavel like a war drum, trying to bury Jasmine Crockett and barking at security to drag her out. 1 minute later, she rose from her seat, leaned in with fire in her eyes, delivered a single razor-sharp line, and unleashed evidence so explosive it ripped the color from his face. The room froze. The air turned electric. What did she reveal about election corruption that left one of the most feared judges in America utterly speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The federal courtroom of the Northern District of Texas stood like a cold fortress, its towering ceiling swallowed by hard white light that made every surface glare. The marble floor turned each step into a slow, heavy drumbeat, a warning that something dangerous was about to break. Today's case was Coalition for Voter Access VOI. State of Texas, a high-stakes fight over a new state voting law, accused of stripping thousands of eligible citizens of their right to cast a ballot. At the plaintiff's table sat the Coalition for Voter Access, a united front of civil rights groups, led by Congresswoman and attorney Jasmine Crockett, notorious for taking her battles straight into the lion's den. Across from her, the state of Texas was defended by Deputy Attorney General Maxwell Reed, a man whose 20 years of courtroom wins came from turning pressure into precision. On the bench, Judge Anthony Terenga loomed 15 years of federal authority, a history of siding with state power, and an iron grip over every inch of his courtroom. Before the first witness could be sworn in, Terenga's voice cracked through the air like a whip. Ms. Crockett, your words yesterday did more than criticize, they struck at the heart of this court's honor. He accused her of weakening the court and seeding doubt about its integrity. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Heads turned toward Crockett, eyes locked. The first collision was about to happen. The judge's accusation still cut through the room like a blade, the echo of his words lingering in the cold air. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, didn't blink. Her hands rested on the table, steady, as if she were holding the whole weight of her case in her palms. She drew in a measured breath, her gaze locked on the bench. Your Honor, I simply stated the truth. Voter witnesses in this case have been cut off at the knees, given minutes to speak, while state officials have been allowed to spin hypothetical scenarios for hours without a shred of evidence. Her voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was sharp enough to cut. Around the room, a few heads turned, as though they just heard someone step over a line no one dared cross. Judge Terenga's jaw tightened, the muscles working under the skin like coiled rope. His voice came low and clipped, each word deliberate. So you are saying I am biased? The silence after his question was thick, heavy enough to press against the walls. Crockett didn't look away. Her tone didn't rise, but it carried a weight that forced everyone to listen. I'm saying the law is being applied unevenly, she replied, and this courtroom is where that imbalance must be corrected. The words hung there, not loud but powerful, a challenge wrapped in precision. Across the aisle, Maxwell Reed leaned forward, sensing the air turning dangerous. His voice was smooth, practiced. Perhaps we should move past this, Your Honor, and get to today's witnesses. It was the kind of interjection meant to defuse a bomb before it went off. But Terenga didn't even glance his way. His hand sliced the air in a single, curt motion. No, we will address this now. The room seemed to shrink, the sound of that single word no, tightening the air like a wire pulled to breaking point. The space between Crockett and Terenga became a battlefield without movement, the clash happening in their locked eyes and measured words. Every sentence she spoke slid like a blade into the exposed gaps of his rulings, and the gallery could feel it, the pulse of something about to explode. The collision arrived a heartbeat later, and it came with law, not noise. Crockett's hand moved slowly, deliberately toward a slim binder at the edge of her table, the soft slide of paper on wood cutting through the silence. She looked directly at the bench, her tone steady but edged with steel. Jasmine Crockett, Your Honor, I'm citing a recent Supreme Court precedent, Democratic National Committee versus Wisconsin State Legislature, decided in 2020, which makes it clear, this court must give priority to first-hand testimony from voters who have been directly harmed. That means real stories from real people who have lived the barrier, not endless hypotheticals from officials who have never faced it. The law is explicit, the holding is precise, and it leaves no room for misinterpretation. Real voices deserve the floor before imagined scenarios. That's not opinion, it's the unyielding command of the highest court in this country. For a moment, the air shifted. The hum of quiet breathing in the gallery thinned, and it was as if the walls themselves leaned closer, absorbing the force of what she had just said. Even those who didn't know the law could feel the balance tip in her favor. Precedent was a weapon, and she had just drawn it. Judge Terenga's eyes locked on her, but she didn't falter. The tension was so tight it felt like the room was holding its own breath, waiting to see who would break first. Then the break came not with words of rebuttal, but with the crack of a gavel that detonated against the bench. The sound ricocheted through the marble chamber like a gunshot, sharp enough to jolt the shoulders of those in the first row. "Bailiff, take her into custody for contempt of court now." The order was a blade, slicing cleanly through the fragile stillness. Metal answered him. The bailiff's hand went to his belt, and the cold bite of steel came alive with a mechanical snap, the handcuffs clacking open in a hard, icy ring that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. It was the sound of authority moving from threat to action. Two attorneys erupted from their chairs in unison, the scrape of wood against stone cutting through their overlapping shouts. "Objection, Your Honor," one called, his voice edged with outrage, while the other's tone cracked under the urgency. The witness row turned to stone. No one moved, no one whispered. Faces were fixed forward, eyes locked on the space between the bailiff's slow advance and the woman at the center of the storm. Crockett didn't shift. She stood straight, shoulders squared, her chin level as if she were carved from something harder than the courtroom stone. Her gaze stayed locked on the bench, an unbroken line of defiance and composure. The distance between them had become a boundary neither was willing to cross, not in words, not in posture. The bailiff was already in motion, the cold glint of steel in his hand, when Jasmine Crockett's arm rose, not in panic, but in control. The gesture was sharp, deliberate, the kind that made people stop before they even knew why. The bailiff froze mid-step. Her voice was calm, but it cut through the thick air with surgical precision. "Before you put those cuffs on me, Your Honor, you need to explain this." She reached down to her case and pulled out a slim packet of documents. It didn't look like much, just a few pages clipped together, but the way she held it, the way the paper caught the light, it felt like a weapon. "These," she began, placing them deliberately on the evidence table, "are emails from your official court account." She paused, letting the weight of that fact hang in the air. "They are between you and Richard Fulton, the CEO, whose company was awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to roll out the new voting system." The murmurs in the gallery died instantly. She wasn't rushing. She wanted every word to land. She flipped the first page, turning it so the judge could see. "Now, this isn't just technical chatter about software or logistics," she continued. Her finger tapped the paragraph in the middle, the sound sharp against the paper. "This right here is detailed guidance on how to draft certain provisions so they stand up to any legal challenge." She looked up, locking eyes with Terenga. "And that, Your Honor, just happens to be the exact law we are litigating in this courtroom today." Her voice didn't rise, but the tension in the room did. The attorneys on both sides leaned forward, trying to read over her shoulder. The bailiff, still holding the open cuffs, glanced uncertainly at the bench. Every person in the room could feel the shift. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't rumor. This was concrete. Jasmine slid her finger to the top of the page, tapping the email header. "And the timestamps," she said, "are crystal clear. These messages were sent 3 months before the law was made public." She let that sink in. A few eyebrows in the jury box shot upward. In the gallery, 1 or 2 people exchanged quick looks, as if confirming to themselves they'd heard her correctly. Then she drove the point home. "That means, Your Honor, you were directly involved in shaping the law before you ever sat down to judge it." The sentence landed like a blow, measured, heavy, impossible to deflect. She wasn't yelling, but her tone carried an authority that filled every corner of the marble chamber. The air itself seemed to change. The quiet hum of the ventilation became deafening in the stillness. The gallery didn't move. No one shuffled their papers or shifted in their seat. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone realizes they're watching a moment that will be talked about for years. Up on the bench, Terenga didn't speak. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly against the gavel. It wasn't the look of a man dismissing an accusation. It was the look of someone calculating the weight of it. Jasmine didn't let up. She slid the packet a few inches closer, her voice steady. "This is not bias, Your Honor. This is active participation. This is a judge taking part in crafting a law and then presiding over the case that decides whether that law stands." She took a step back, not in retreat, but to let the statement breathe. That's not just inappropriate, it's a direct violation of the fundamental principle of fairness. Her words stripped the matter to its core, making it impossible for anyone to hide behind legal jargon or procedural fog. The line between judge and litigant wasn't just blurred, it had been crossed in writing, with timestamps and signatures. The courtroom held its breath, the moment suspended, as if the very building was weighing the truth she had just laid out. And in that silence, the handcuffs in the bailiff's hand felt heavier than ever, their purpose suddenly unclear. Because after what had just been revealed, it was no longer obvious who in that room should be wearing them. The air was still electric from her last revelation, but Jasmine Crockett didn't let it fade. If the first strike had been a precise cut, this was going to be a deep wound. She straightened her posture, her shoulders square, her gaze never wavering from the bench. The pause she allowed was deliberate, letting the judge and everyone in the room believe for half a breath that she might be done. Then she stepped forward, voice steady, but edged like a drawn blade. "And that's not all," she said, each word slow enough to sting. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single page, crisp and stark against the wood of the evidence table. Her fingers slid it forward until it sat in full view. "Here is a record of 3 private dinners between you and Mr. Fulton, right in the middle of the period when this law was being drafted. There was no mistaking the collective intake of breath from the gallery. 3 private dinners, not one chance meeting, not a single conference luncheon, but repeated intentional contact." Jasmine let the weight of it hang in the room, her eyes still locked on Judge Terenga, as if daring him to deny it. "These meetings," she continued, her tone sharpening, "were never reported to the Judicial Ethics Committee, as is required for any contact with individuals who have a direct stake in legislation under judicial review." She didn't need to add what everyone in the room already understood. Failure to report wasn't just a minor oversight, it was a violation, a choice. Without breaking the rhythm of her delivery, Jasmine reached for a second document and placed it directly on top of the first. The soft slap of paper on paper carried through the tense silence. "And this," she said, her voice firm, "is a signed verification from your court's own IT department." Her hand rested flat on the page, holding it there like it might otherwise blow away. "It confirms that every single one of these emails and calendar entries is authentic, that they were retrieved lawfully, and that there is no question about their origin or their accuracy." The meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't hearsay. It wasn't an unverified leak. This was the court's own machinery confirming the truth. Even those in the gallery without legal training could see the trap snapping shut. Jasmine didn't stop there. Her next move was as methodical as it was devastating. She lifted a smaller slip of paper and read aloud, her voice slow and clear, so that each word landed in the still air. "A judge shall not advise or assist a party with a direct financial interest in a case before them." She looked up from the paper, her eyes never leaving the man on the bench. "That's not my interpretation. That's the Federal Judicial Code of Conduct, Your Honor. Plain, unambiguous. It could not be written any clearer." The room absorbed the line like a shockwave. There was no room for argument here, no legal loophole to slide through. The code's language was direct, and Jasmine had just drawn a perfect, unbroken line from that rule to the judge's conduct. Across the aisle, the man who had spent the last days opposing her, Deputy Attorney General Maxwell Reed, shifted forward in his seat. His usual courtroom calm was still there, but his voice carried a weight it hadn't before. "If this is true," Reed said, his tone grave and deliberate, "it's not just a serious breach, it's an assault on the very foundation of justice." The words fell heavy in the chamber. For a moment, it didn't matter which side Reed was on. This wasn't about the merits of the case anymore. It was about the integrity of the court itself. Reed's acknowledgement was a rare crack in the usual wall between adversaries. a sign that the accusation wasn't just powerful, it was undeniable. The gallery seemed frozen in place, but the energy in the room had shifted sharply. What had begun as a tense, procedural fight had transformed into something much more volatile. These weren't just allegations of bias. Now these were concrete, documented acts that showed a sitting federal judge engaged in private, undisclosed contact with the CEO of a company, directly profiting from the law he was now judging. Jasmine let the silence stretch again, knowing that in a courtroom, silence could be as loud as shouting. She glanced briefly at the bailiff, who was still holding the open cuffs. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and hesitation. The man had been ordered to restrain her minutes earlier. Now it seemed as though the very air around them questioned whether he should be looking in the other direction. Her eyes returned to Terenga, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. 3 private dinners, unreported, a documented exchange of advice on how to shield this law from legal challenge, and all of it confirmed by your own court's IT department. She didn't have to say the last part. Everyone could finish the thought for themselves. There was no plausible explanation that wouldn't sound like guilt. Reed's earlier words still lingered, an assault on the very foundation of justice. In a room filled with attorneys, clerks, and officers of the court, that was the kind of statement that struck deep. You could argue about evidence, about legal theory, about witness credibility, but when the conversation shifted to the survival of the institution itself, everyone knew they had crossed into dangerous territory. Jasmine stayed rooted where she stood, her stance unwavering. She had presented her evidence not with theatrics, but with the kind of calm, deliberate certainty that left no room for doubt. The paper trail was clear, the ethics rule was clear, and the timing of the meetings was a smoking gun. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath again, but this time it wasn't anticipation of what might come next. It was the shock of realizing what had already been done. The accusations were no longer abstract claims tossed into the air. They had been nailed down in ink, time-stamped and verified. In that moment, Jasmine had taken the balance of power in the room and flipped it. A few minutes earlier, she had been the one standing on the edge of contempt charges. Now, the man on the bench was the one sitting in the shadow of something far more dangerous, a public record of conduct that could shake the very seat he occupied. Terenga's jaw tightened. He gripped the gavel, its polished handle slick in his palm, and slammed it once, the crack ricocheting through the chamber. "This court will recess for 30 minutes, he said, voice clipped. Without another glance at anyone, he rose and disappeared through the side door, leaving the air thick with the knowledge that the next 30 minutes could change everything. The 30-minute recess passed like a slow bleed of time, every tick of the clock dragging the tension tighter. Every whispered conversation in the gallery, carrying the weight of the bombshell Crockett had just dropped. People shifted in their seats but never let their eyes leave the empty bench, waiting for the man who had ruled this courtroom like an unshakable pillar to return. Even the air felt heavier, as if the room itself understood that something irreversible had happened. When Judge Terenga finally walked back in, the energy shifted instantly. His steps were measured but lacked the force they carried earlier. His robe, once seeming to drape over an untouchable figure, now looked like fabric hanging on a man caught in a storm. His face had lost its confident color, his jaw tight as if every muscle fought to hold composure. He lowered himself into the chair behind the bench with a deliberate slowness, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, less the voice of authority issuing commands, and more the voice of a man trying to steady himself on crumbling ground. "The emails and the meetings exist," he said plainly, the admission landing in the room like a hammer on stone. He didn't pause long enough for anyone to mistake this for a false confession, but the silence that followed was deafening. Then came the attempt at a shield, his words folding around themselves. They were exchanges in the context of a professional conference. The phrasing was careful, dressed in formality, as though a change in tone could rewrite the meaning of the facts. But the documents Crockett had laid bare still sat on the evidence table, their existence as real and stubborn as the stares fixed on him. Every person in that chamber knew what they were looking at, a judge with his back to the wall. The evidence was no longer theory, it was time-stamped, corroborated, and in black and white. And those in the gallery could read more than just paper. They could read the air, the way Terenga's explanation sagged under its own weight. He scanned the room, and for the first time all morning, It wasn't the crowd shrinking under the judge's gaze. It was the judge, confronted by an audience he could no longer command. He swallowed once, his Adam's apple jerking in a way that betrayed more than his carefully chosen words. Finally, his eyes returned to the bench before him, as though addressing the wood might be easier than meeting Crockett's stare. His voice was even, but each sentence seemed to cost him. Accordingly, he began, the single word feeling like the slow turn of a wheel toward an ending he couldn't avoid. I will recuse myself from further proceedings in this matter. It was the legal equivalent of a white flag, and the meaning wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had tried to have Crockett cuffed and removed now had no choice but to step aside. He didn't stop there. The contempt order against Congresswoman Crockett is vacated. The words clipped and official carried a strange dual weight-part admission of overreach, part surrender of the very authority he had wielded minutes before. A ripple passed through the room, an almost physical shift in the air, as the balance of power recalibrated in real time. Then came the final blow to his own standing. This case will be reassigned to another judge, and all witness testimony previously limited will be reconsidered in full. No one missed the implication everything he had tried to control, to narrow to silence, would now be reopened under new eyes. It wasn't just a procedural change, it was a complete undoing of the battlefield he had tried to set. The reaction from the gallery was immediate, though not in shouts or applause. A wave of low whispers broke out, growing and spreading like a current, the sound of people recalculating everything they thought they knew about who held the power here. It wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, like gravel shifting under the pressure of something massive moving above it. Lawyers exchanged glances that were half disbelief, half satisfaction. Even Reed, who had stood opposed to Crockett earlier, now sat back with a look that blended grudging respect with quiet recognition that the ground had shifted permanently. Terenga sat there for a moment longer, his hands folded too tightly on the bench, his knuckles pale. In another life, perhaps even earlier that same morning, this had been his domain. Now it felt more like a place he was being permitted to occupy for the last time. His eyes scanned the room again, but the looks that met him were no longer deferential. They were watchful, assessing, the kind of stares reserved for someone whose authority had just been publicly dismantled. For Crockett, standing in the same position she had before the recess, nothing about her posture had changed, shoulders straight, chin lifted, gaze steady. But the entire room could feel the difference. The space between her and the bench was no longer the gap between challenger and ruler. It was the gap between the one who had weathered the storm and the one it had swallowed. The court reporter's fingers moved quickly, ensuring every word and every shift in tone was preserved in the permanent record. History wasn't just being made, it was being transcribed in real time. By the time Terenga's gavel tapped not with the violent crack from earlier, but with a controlled, almost reluctant knock, the transformation was complete. The same authority that had ordered her arrest had now dissolved in the face of unshakable evidence and unyielding resolve. And everyone in that room, from the seasoned attorneys to the last spectator in the back row, understood exactly what they had just witnessed. A power that once seemed untouchable had collapsed, not with a single blow, but under the slow, unrelenting weight of truth that refused to be moved. The gavel's echo from Terenga's retreat had barely faded when the clerk's voice cut through the lingering tension. This case is reassigned to the Honorable Judge Elaine Rodriguez. It was a sentence that might have sounded procedural on paper, but in that courtroom, it hit like a turning tide. People who knew her name, and almost everyone did, shifted in their seats. Rodriguez was not the kind of judge you could charm or corner. Her reputation stretched from law school lecture halls to the highest appellate circles. Fair, unflinching, and relentlessly thorough. She had no patience for shortcuts, and even less for hidden hands trying to steer her courtroom from the shadows. The moment her name was spoken, it felt as if the marble walls themselves straightened. The air sharpened. The spectacle was over. The fight for the truth had begun. When Rodriguez entered, she didn't glide or pause for effect. She walked with the steady, measured pace of someone who already owned the ground she stepped on. She took her seat without fanfare, but her gaze swept the room with surgical precision, pausing just long enough on each side to let both plaintiff and defense know she was reading more than their filings. Her voice, when it came, was calm but edged with authority. Before we proceed, I am reviewing all procedural limitations previously set in this case. Her eyes moved to the clerk, her tone flat and final. Recall every witness previously dismissed or barred from testifying. The words landed like a gavel strike of their own. Lawyers on both sides froze for half a second, then erupted into movement. Papers shuffled, pens scratched furiously across legal pads, aides whispered updates to their leads. Witnesses who had been cast aside by Terenga's restrictions suddenly had a path back into the light. The order wasn't just a technical adjustment, it was a declaration of war on imbalance. For weeks, testimony had been strangled under the guise of relevance or scope, always tilting in favor of the side with more power and deeper pockets. Those doors were now being thrown open. Rodriguez was dismantling the artificial scaffolding that had propped one side higher than the other, piece by piece. The gallery felt the shift. You could see it in the way people leaned forward, some clutching the arms of their chairs, others exchanging quick, sharp glances. They weren't watching a polite exchange of legal arguments anymore. They were watching the battlefield get reset. Rodriguez's next move was equally decisive. Effective immediately, all prior restrictions on questioning are vacated, she said, each word spaced like a step forward in a march. Counsel will have full latitude to pursue lines of inquiry relevant to the facts at hand. We start from neutral ground, and no one stands above the process. She didn't need to raise her voice. The clarity in her tone carried further than volume ever could. Across the room, a defense attorney who had been lounging back in his chair sat up straighter, the casual smirk on his face evaporating. On the plaintiff's side, Crockett's eyes met those of her co-counsel for the briefest second, and something passed between them, recognition that the wall they'd been hammering at for days had just cracked wide open. There was no applause, no visible outburst, but the energy in the room had transformed. It wasn't the stunned silence that followed Terenga's collapse. This was something more electric, more alive in awareness that the case was no longer about navigating around one man's thumb on the scale. Now the process itself was in the hands of someone who would let it run its full course, no matter where it led or who it scorched along the way. Even those in the gallery who had come expecting a one-sided spectacle seemed to sense the difference. The whispered conversations were sharper now, laced with anticipation rather than resignation. The court stenographer's fingers moved faster, trying to keep pace with the quickened rhythm of the room. On the far side, a pair of junior attorneys whispered furiously over a stack of witness statements that had been gathering dust since their exclusion. Every eye kept darting toward the double doors at the back, the ones through which the recalled witnesses would soon walk. The air felt heavier, charged, as if the next phase of the trial wasn't just a continuation, but a resurrection. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly on the bench, her expression unreadable, but unmistakably in command. "This court will not be a stage for posturing," she said, the words slicing neatly through the ambient hum. "It will be a forum for truth, and truth requires that all relevant voices be heard." She let the silence settle after that, long enough for the meaning to sink in. There would be no mistaking her intent. No side would be allowed to game the system. No narrative would survive on technicalities alone. In that moment, the case stopped belonging to the machinations of lawyers and started belonging to the facts themselves. And everyone in that room, from the most seasoned litigator to the quietest spectator, could feel it. The balance had shifted, and the center of gravity now rested squarely in the hands of a judge who saw the law not as a shield for the powerful, but as a level field on which every voice had the right to stand. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, it would be fought on even ground. Under Judge Rodriguez's watch, the air in the courtroom felt different, less like a fight waiting to be stopped, and more like a truth finally being given room to breathe. The first witness, a retired Army sergeant in his late 60s, walked slowly to the stand. His posture was straight, but the tremor in his voice carried the weight of years in uniform and the sting of what he was about to say. He explained how he had been turned away from his polling place because his driver's license still listed an old apartment. "I brought a utility bill. I brought my VA card, both in my name. They said it wasn't enough." His words were plain, but they cut deeper than any lawyer's argument. The room stayed still, as if leaning in. No one interrupted. Rodriguez's eyes stayed fixed on him, her gavel idle, her voice calm but firm when one attorney shifted as if to speak. "Let him finish." And so, for the first time in this case, the full account went into the record without a single word being sliced away. Next came a nurse still wearing the loose blue scrubs of a 12-hour hospital shift. She took the stand with the unsteady sway of exhaustion, but her voice was steady enough to draw every ear. She told how she'd raced from the ER to her polling site, only to find every voting machine down for maintenance. She was told to come back later, and when she did, she was handed a provisional ballot. Weeks later, she learned it had been rejected without explanation. Her testimony was a slow burn, building detail by detail until the injustice was impossible to miss. Rodriguez didn't just let her speak. She leaned forward, listening in a way that made it clear this wasn't a performance, it was an official record that mattered. Jasmine took notes in tight, deliberate strokes, her pen clicking once when the nurse described the moment she realized her vote hadn't been counted. The third witness was a college sophomore. Her eyes were sharp, her voice quick, but her hands gripped the wooden rail as though holding herself steady. She testified that her precinct had been moved more than 2 miles from its usual site with no signage and no notice posted where it used to be. The official notice of change had been mailed to her old dorm address, a mailbox she no longer had access to. Jasmine, without breaking eye contact with the bench, lifted the very envelope in question, its yellow forwarding label carrying the wrong date. She placed it gently but decisively on the evidence table. "The postmark speaks for itself," she said, her tone clipped and final. No one tried to speak over her. Then a wheelchair user rolled forward, the rhythmic hum of the wheels breaking the quiet. His account was brutal in its simplicity. The ramp to the polling site had been chained shut. The voting moved temporarily upstairs, and no one offered to bring down a ballot. "I could hear people voting above me," he said softly, "but I wasn't one of them." The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even those who had been silent skeptics earlier seemed to stiffen at the thought. Rodriguez's gaze flicked toward the defense table. No words were needed to show she understood the weight of what had just been said. Cross-examination was no longer a one-sided weapon. Reed, sharp and unflinching, pressed each witness. He asked the sergeant about exact timelines when he arrived, how long he waited, when he was turned away. He questioned the nurse about whether signage had been present earlier in the day. He pressed the student on whether email reminders had been sent to her student account. He asked the wheelchair user whether alternative sites had been listed anywhere. Each question was backed with exhibits, poll books marked with entry times, maintenance logs for the voting machines, precinct maps with addresses in black and white, and printed emails from election officials. He moved quickly, his tone direct but not hostile, trying to punch holes in the story before it could settle into certainty. But Jasmine was ready. She countered each point not with rhetoric, but with paper. For the sergeant, she had hotline call records with timestamps matching the moments he'd been refused entry. For the nurse, she produced the chain of custody forms showing her provisional ballot had been received and rejected without reason noted. For the student, she held clerk's emails admitting the forwarding date was entered incorrectly. And for the wheelchair user, she displayed a still frame from a security camera. The ramp chained shut at 6:59 a.m., 1 minute before the polls opened, with the official opening sign taped above it. Every move was deliberate. Every word spoken was chosen for impact, not volume. The evidence wasn't just thrown out like punches, it was laid down like bricks in a wall, each one supporting the next until it became something no one could easily climb over. On one side of the courtroom, logs matched against logs, maps against maps, testimony against time codes. On the other side, the faces of the jury, if there had been one, would have shown a slow, undeniable shift. Even without a panel, the gallery acted like a silent chorus, tracking every turn, every counterpunch. By the end of the exchange, the room wasn't the same. It had gone from the chaos of interruption and dismissal to the precision of a controlled firefight. And for the first time in this case, the truth wasn't just knocking at the door, it was sitting at the center of the room, looking each person in the eye, daring them to deny it. The air in the courtroom still carried the weight of every testimony that had just been delivered, like the echo of a storm that refused to fade. The murmurs had died down to absolute silence, but the tension hadn't loosened its grip. Every set of eyes, lawyers, journalists, citizens remained locked on Judge Elaine Rodriguez, who sat at the bench with an expression that revealed nothing and yet promised everything. She didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, let the anticipation build until it became a living thing pressing against the walls. When she finally moved, it was deliberate, her hands coming together, fingertips touching in a posture that was both thoughtful and unshakably firm. Her gaze swept the courtroom slowly, as though measuring the weight of every soul before her. Then she leaned slightly forward, and her voice broke the air, not with volume, but with a steady, controlled authority that cut sharper than a shout. "This court," she began, her tone carrying the precision of someone who knew the gravity of every word, "will strike down the provisions that directly obstruct the right to vote." The words landed like a hammer blow, final and inescapable. A ripple of reaction moved through the gallery, sharp inhales, widened eyes, and the faint rustle of clothing as people shifted forward in their seats. Rodriguez did not pause to let the room recover. She continued, each sentence a clean incision through months of legal chaos. "The remaining sections, those that stand within the bounds of law, will remain." The phrasing was simple, yet the impact was anything but. In one breath, she had dismantled the most dangerous parts of the contested law, and in the next, preserved what was legally sound, refusing to let the case dissolve into total destruction. It wasn't a swing of the pendulum, it was a careful recalibration of the entire system. Then, with the kind of deliberate care only a seasoned judge could summon, Rodriguez turned her attention to the clerk. Her tone slowed, the cadence deliberate, as if each syllable was being set into stone. "Direct eyewitness testimony shall remain the cornerstone in the evaluation of any election law." The clerk's pen scratched across the page, capturing every word, the sound somehow amplified in the quiet. Each letter etched into the official record was more than ink on paper. It was a binding declaration of principle, a restoration of a standard that some in the room had quietly feared was slipping away. The weight of that sentence settled over the chamber like an undeniable truth. It was a statement that left no room for manipulation, no space for interpretation to be twisted. Every lawyer in the room understood what it meant. Moving forward, no abstract argument, no detached theory, no political spin would ever outweigh the voices of those who had lived the harm firsthand. It was a return to a form of justice that was rooted not in speculation, but in human reality. From the prosecution table, there was no attempt at protest, only the taut stillness of defeat. On the defense side, a flicker of relief passed between a few eyes, though no one dared to break composure. In the gallery, the impact was quieter but deeper. Some faces softened, some jaws unclenched, and others blinked rapidly, as though holding back the kind of tears that came when something once believed to be lost was suddenly found again. Rodriguez's eyes moved again, taking in the scene as though to silently tell the room that the work wasn't finished, but that this chapter was. She didn't allow herself a smile, but there was an unspoken resolve in her gaze. She had not just ruled on a case, she had drawn a boundary in the sand for the entire nation to see. Her voice, her ruling, her commitment to the foundation of justice, it all fused into one decisive moment that would be replayed, quoted, and studied for years to come. The gavel didn't fall immediately. She let the decision breathe in the air, gave it time to settle into the bones of everyone present. Only then did she raise her hand, the polished wood glinting under the chamber lights, and bring it down in a single, measured strike. The sound echoed off the marble walls, not as an end, but as the confirmation of a beginning, a new standard carved into the heart of the law. By the time the sound faded, the courtroom was no longer the same place it had been minutes before. The balance of power had shifted, and even those who had fought hardest against this outcome couldn't deny the force of what had just occurred. Justice had spoken, and it hadn't whispered, it had declared itself, in words that could not be ignored, erased, or undone. The weeks that followed the ruling did not bring silence, they brought study. The Harvard Law Review, in its midterm issue, dedicated an entire lead article to the case, treating it not as an isolated courtroom drama, but as a live demonstration of how an attorney, armed with skill and unshakable resolve, can dismantle overreach where it dares to stand in open court. The tone of the piece was not sentimental, it was precise, almost surgical, dissecting the sequence of moves that had turned what seemed like a losing battle into a precedent-shaping victory. They began with the opening strike, Crockett's invocation of Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, not as abstract doctrine, but as a living principle, delivered with the force of someone who had carried the weight of those words in real-world fights. From there, the review traced each pivot with the same care one might give to reconstructing a historic chess match. The introduction of undisputed timestamps, the production of authenticated email threads, the strategic pause before revealing IT-certified verification of the evidence. Each move, they wrote, was not thrown but placed deliberate. The review then turned to the most volatile moment, the revelation of the 3 undisclosed private dinners between Terenga and Fulton during the drafting of the very law now under trial. They highlighted how Crockett framed this revelation not as a personal attack, but as a direct breach of federal ethics, quoting her precise citation, "A judge shall not advise or assist a party with a direct interest in a case before them." That line, the review observed, struck the courtroom like a blade, clean, swift, and beyond interpretation. It was here, they argued, that the narrative shifted irreversibly from speculation to undeniable conflict of interest. In a section titled, "When the Bench Trembles," the review described how even Reed opposing counsel had to acknowledge the gravity of the breach, uttering, "If this is true, this is not just a serious violation, it's an attack on the foundation of justice." The article froze that moment in print, noting the subtle yet visible ripple it sent through the gallery, the jurors, and the judge himself. They analyzed the psychological toll, how the combination of factual weight and public exposure narrowed Terenga's room to maneuver until recusal became not a concession, but a necessity. The review didn't shy away from the drama of the 30-minute recess that followed. They described it as a silence that functioned like a clock ticking inside the mind of the accused, and then unpacked Terenga's return, face pale, tone muted, attempting to frame his meetings and emails as professional exchanges in a conference context. The review's commentary here was sharp. When the evidence speaks in timestamps, explanation becomes confession. They detailed how the gavel's next strike did not carry the sound of judgment, but of surrender recusal, the withdrawal of the arrest order, and the transfer of the case to Judge Elaine Rodriguez. From there, the review zoomed out, treating Rodriguez's appointment as more than a procedural step. They wrote that her reputation for fairness and rigor reset the gravitational pull of the trial, pulling it back into alignment with the principles of balance and transparency. They documented her first act, recalling all witnesses who had previously been silenced as a symbolic and substantive rebalancing of the scales. It was, in the review's words, the legal equivalent of reopening a door that had been bolted shut in full view of the public. But the heart of the Harvard analysis was not biography or even judicial behavior, it was doctrine. They drove home that Rodriguez's final written opinion, striking down the voting barriers while preserving valid provisions, was anchored in a single unshakable line. Direct eyewitness testimony is a foundation that cannot be ignored when judging election laws. The review lingered here, framing it as a revival of a neglected legal truth. They noted how this articulation will now live in citations for years to come, invoked in future cases as both a legal standard and a reminder of what can happen when the human impact of law is allowed to speak. The final paragraphs hit with the precision of a closing argument. This was not one on passion alone, and they wrote, it was one on record-anchored facts, strategically deployed, in a room where the imbalance of power was real and tangible. The review argued that the case should be studied not just in law schools, but in legislative halls and judicial ethics trainings, as proof that the mechanics of due process, properly understood and fearlessly applied, remain capable of defending democracy even in its most vulnerable moments. And then came the line that would be quoted again and again. A courtroom is not a stage for authority, it is an engine for accountability. For the Harvard Law Review, the lesson was clear: when law, patience, and courage meet, the bench does not stand above the law, it stands within it. And in that truth, they concluded, lies the very possibility of resistance. The weight of Judge Rodriguez's ruling still hung in the air, like the last note of a symphony when Jasmine Crockett stepped back into the Capitol. It wasn't the walk of someone basking in victory. It was the return of someone carrying unfinished business, someone determined to make sure the truth that had just been fought for inside a courtroom did not fade into the noise of politics. The chamber was already filling with the low hum of private conversations. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the sound thinned, almost as if the room itself sensed the gravity of her arrival. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace, every step echoing against the marble floor. There was no theatrics in her posture, no exaggerated display of confidence. What radiated from her was something rarer, resolve sharpened into steel. She reached the podium, placed her hands firmly on either side, and looked up at the lawmakers in front of her. When she began to speak, her voice was calm even, but carried a force that pressed into every corner of the room. "Justice is not the property of the powerful," she began, her words cutting through the stillness like a blade. "It belongs to the truth and the law if you have the courage to defend it." The sentence didn't just hang in the air, it rooted itself there, as if daring anyone to dispute it. Her tone wasn't pleading or confrontational, it was declarative, an unshakable statement of fact. A few heads turned toward one another, exchanging glances. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. She was not just addressing the people in the room, she was putting every person who ever held public office on notice. Her eyes swept across the chamber, lingering on those who had the most to lose if her words took hold. She didn't need to call them out by name. The silence between her sentences did that for her. She moved into the heart of her message without breaking rhythm. She spoke of what had unfolded in the courtroom, not as a chain of events, but as a lesson carved out of conflict. She recalled the silenced witnesses now heard. She described the evidence, once buried under procedural games, now restored to the record. She made no attempt to soften the reality that a judge had been forced to step aside because the integrity of the bench had been compromised. Her voice didn't waver when she made it clear. This was not a fluke, not an isolated breach. "We didn't just win a case," she said, leaning into the microphone, her gaze unblinking. "We proved that the law still works when you work it." The words landed with the precision of a gavel strike measured, final, undeniable. Some in the chamber nodded slightly, reluctant but unable to deny the truth in her statement. Others stared at their papers, pretending to be absorbed in notes they weren't actually reading. There was no applause yet. This was not a speech designed to rally cheers. This was a reckoning. Crockett kept going, dismantling the quiet myth that power can bend justice without consequence. She reminded them that the law is not an ornament to be displayed when convenient, it is a shield and a sword, and it belongs equally to the weakest citizen and the highest office holder. Her words didn't rise in volume, but the intensity was undeniable. She was speaking in the same tone she had used in court-controlled, deliberate, but laced with the kind of conviction that makes people lean forward, even if they don't want to. The air in the room had changed. What started as polite stillness became something heavier, more charged. Her sentence about courage, "If you have the courage to defend it," echoed like a challenge that no one could accept without first examining their own record. Crockett didn't flinch. She held the silence when it came, letting it sharpen the edges of her point. When she finally stepped back from the podium, the room remained suspended in that tension. A few hands rose to clap, then more followed, not an eruption, but a deliberate, steady recognition of what had just been said. It wasn't celebration, it was acknowledgement. And as she turned to leave, it was clear this was not the end of the battle. This was the moment the fight had been written into the record. The verdict had become more than just a legal decision. It was now a marker, a lesson in plain view for anyone who might believe that robes and titles place them above the law. In that chamber, the power of her words didn't just rest in what they meant for her case, it rested in the reminder that justice, when defended with courage, belongs to no one man or woman, but to the truth itself. The echo of Crockett's last words still clung to the marble walls, but what lingered longer was the unspoken realization that this case had left behind something bigger than headlines or legal briefs. This was not just about a courtroom win, it was about the shift in the air when people realized the law was not a fortress guarded by the powerful, but a bridge anyone could walk across if they had the courage. It was the kind of moment that carved itself into memory, a moment people would recount years from now, not for the drama of the trial, but for the truth it exposed. And that truth came with a lesson, a human one, that no one in that room would be able to unhear. That lesson began with the simplest observation. Power does not dissolve under the weight of argument alone. It crumbles when the truth is spoken without fear. Crockett's fight had been about more than legal technicalities. It had been about stripping away the layers of intimidation that keep ordinary people silent. In a system where the loudest voices often belong to those with the deepest pockets, her defiance was proof that persistence, when rooted in integrity, can pierce through even the most fortified defenses. The law doesn't care how big your building is or how many titles you collect, she had told a small group of aides afterward. It cares about what's right, and that's why it's worth fighting for. Those words, simple and unscripted, carried as much weight as anything she'd said on the record. The human cost of that fight was easy to overlook from the outside. Every late night poring over documents, every closed-door meeting where allies warned her to back down, every moment she had to measure her words so they could not be twisted, it had all been a gauntlet. And yet she had chosen to walk through it because stepping back would have meant conceding that the powerful could define the limits of justice. The lesson here was not that courage comes without fear, it was that courage is what moves forward, even when fear is pressing in from every side. This was the kind of truth that could not be learned in law school or written into statutes. It had to be lived, earned, and carried. People in the gallery who had once sat as silent observers left with something heavier in their hands than the verdict. They left with a sense of responsibility. If one person could stand in the path of a flawed system and force it to correct itself, then the rest of them could no longer claim that change was impossible. That realization is dangerous not to the public, but to those who depend on apathy to keep their grip on control. And that was the deeper human truth burning at the center of this story. Injustice survives on silence, and it begins to die the moment people refuse to be quiet. The ripple effect of what had happened in that courtroom began to show almost immediately. Law students dissected the case not just for its legal strategies, but for the moral spine behind those strategies. Community organizers pointed to it as proof that the courtroom could be a battlefield for civil rights, not just a place where the powerful came to sign off on their own decisions. In small town halls, in whispered conversations, in church basements, in coffee shops and community centers, Crockett's case became shorthand for the idea that justice wasn't a gift, it was a demand. And demands had to be made, again and again, until they were met. But the most profound lesson lay in the way Crockett herself framed the victory. She didn't stand on the steps of the courthouse and claim she had defeated a corrupt system. She didn't declare herself a hero. Instead, she told reporters, "If the law worked for me today, it has to work for the next person tomorrow, or it means nothing." That was the line that stuck with people. It reminded them that justice is not a trophy to be displayed after a hard fight. It's a living obligation, something that must be guarded and renewed with every case, every decision, every voice willing to speak up. There was also a warning tucked inside that lesson, one that many missed at first. Wins like this are not permanent. The forces that tried to silence witnesses, that tried to bend the law to serve power, would regroup. They always do. And when they return, the only thing standing between them and success is whether people remember the courage they witnessed here and choose to match it. Crockett's victory was proof that the system can be forced to work, but it was also proof that without vigilance, it can just as easily be bent back into a weapon against the very people it's meant to protect. In that sense, the story was not a neat ending, but a call to arms, a call not for violence but for awareness, for stubborn refusal to accept that's just the way it is. It was a reminder that the gap between what is legal and what is just can be closed, but only if people keep closing it, brick by brick, case by case. That's the kind of lesson that doesn't just live in law reviews or political speeches, it lives in the quiet decisions people make every day about whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to act or turn away. And so the true legacy of this case would not be the headlines, the televised clips, or even the quotes that trended for a few hours. It would be the shift in the people who had seen it unfold, who now understood that justice was not an untouchable ideal, but a living, breathing practice. and that they too had a role in it. If you see something wrong, Crockett had told one young law clerk who nervously approached her afterward, don't wait for someone braver to fix it. That braver person might be you. In that single sentence lay the entire heartbeat of the lesson. Courage is contagious, but it only spreads when someone is willing to take the first step. By the time Crockett left the Capitol that day, the story was already leaving her hands and finding its way into others. Some would carry it as inspiration, some would carry it as a challenge, and some, those who had relied on silence, would carry it as a warning. But for everyone, whether they admitted it or not, the case had rewritten the boundaries of what was possible when truth and law were met with unflinching resolve. That was the human truth this story gave to the world, and it was one that would not be easy to forget. The lesson had been delivered, but Crockett knew that a lesson without action was just a story people forgot when the news cycle moved on. She stood at the center of the chamber, her eyes scanning the faces before her lawmakers, aides, journalists, and citizens, each one holding the choice of whether this moment would matter tomorrow. The air was charged, not with the quiet relief of victory, but with the restless hum of possibility. She took a slow breath, leaned toward the microphone, and let her voice cut through the room with the precision of a blade. Justice is not a spectator sport, she said, each word deliberate. It belongs to the ones who show up, who speak out, and who refuse to be moved. The chamber fell into a stillness so deep it felt as if even the cameras dared not blink. This was no closing statement, it was an ignition. She didn't soften her tone for comfort. Instead, she pressed forward, knowing that the truth needed to sting if it was going to stick. You don't need a title to defend the truth, she continued. You need courage, and courage is not a gift. It's a decision you make every single day. Her gaze moved toward the public gallery, where ordinary people sat with their hands clasped, as if weighing her words against the weight of their own lives. If you're waiting for the perfect moment to stand up, you'll wait forever, because the perfect moment is when you realize that silence serves the wrong side. The echo of her voice rolled back across the chamber like a wave, daring anyone to ignore it. Crockett then shifted from principle to action, giving the kind of direction that stripped away excuses. Start where you are, in your neighborhood, your workplace, your school board meetings. Pay attention to the laws they pass when you're not looking. Ask questions that make them uncomfortable. And when they tell you to sit down, stand taller. There was no theatrics in her delivery, only the kind of conviction that comes from having lived the fight she was urging others to take on. She spoke as someone who knew that the small, stubborn acts of defiance, the ones no headline ever sees, were what built the foundation for the moments that do make history. Her voice dropped slightly, but the intensity remained. Don't let this case be an isolated victory. Let it be your example that change doesn't happen when we wait for someone else to lead it, happens when we take the first step ourselves. The weight of her words landed hard. This wasn't the rhetoric of a politician fishing for applause. This was the charge of someone who understood that battles are won in courtrooms, yes, but also in living rooms, break rooms, and street corners. If you were born with a voice, use it. If you have a platform, share it. And if you have the truth, protect it like your life depends on it, because one day it might. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.